Crossing the Divide, written by RFNAG. Chapter 4. Shocking experiences during our flight. I was looking all around beneath me, just absolutely amazed, not only at the massive numbers of intelligent species, but exotic sights I might never see on Berk. There were spice merchants, and a perfume merchant, an oil merchant. It was just overwhelming, the murmur of the marketplace, and seeing laundry lines crisscrossing over the streets and alleys. Suddenly my vision darkened as a velvety thick fabric obscured my vision, my head and body bending backwards until whatever had been holding onto the cloth gave way. I clawed at the fabric on my face, before gazing shocked at what I held in my hands. I didn't know what kind of fabric it was, but it smooth like velvet, but had a sheen in the light. I'd never encountered this kind of fabric, even with the exotic wares trader Johan brought to Berk to trade with the villagers. For one thing, the fabric was entirely see-through. Why anyone would want clothing to be see-through was beyond me, but I held in my hands what looked like some weird see-through shirt, except it cut off about midway on my stomach, and there were no sleeves, but small ribbons to keep the fabric suspended on my shoulders. Not to mention that it was pink. It was like the pink inside a seashell, but faded. It had to be some female's garment, but its purpose was beyond me. It wouldn't protect from cold, weather or sun, 3 primary reasons why Vikings wore clothes. Well that, and no one wants to see a naked Viking. I've been to too many feasts and festivals where some warrior would get drunk and remove his clothes. By Thor's hammer, I wish I could forget those memories. I heard a shriek, and looked behind me, to find a white-coated Pegasus mare with a light sky-blue mane racing towards me in a panic, or anger. It's still somewhat difficult for me to tell with these ponies. Despite their large expressive eyes, or how their faces are similar to humans. I patted Toothless and pointed behind me, which in hindsight, I probably should have waited until we were over the majority of the buildings. For the next thing I knew, I felt our speed slow, and looked to see a clothesline bending under the weight and speed of Toothless and I. I could only exclaim, before feeling Toothless and I being launched in the opposite direction we came. Toothless, however, was ready for this and folded his wings as he nosed into a dive, the both of us feeling the rush of air, as the Pegasus mare just barely avoided us colliding with her. I knew what Toothless intended to do, as he and I had attempted similar maneuvers back home. First the dive to gain speed, and then when Toothless snapped open his wings, our movement would go from head into the ground, to traveling swiftly over it. Then came obstacle evasion. I laughed as the griffins uttered a set of startled squawks, vibrant coats of tawny gold, or mahogany browns, to creams and white, their wings flaring open, and they reared back upon their hind legs for the majority of them, and ponies screamed in fear, a great many different colors, as ponies reared back, or dashed to get out of the main part of the street. Pegasi flared their wings, but simply didn't have enough time to fly in the air, before I sped past them. I should probably feel bad for startling the locals, but I was caught up in the exhilarating rush and excitement as Toothless dodged about street corners, fruit carts, and the occasional guards. Though, after we had dashed past about 10 city blocks or so, he started flapping his wings to regain the altitude we had lost in the dive to avoid the other Pegasus. Toothless and I looked about the sky as we tried to regain our bearings. Which way had the sun been in our initial flight path? Which way had the shadows been falling? While I had been racking my brain to remember these important details, so that Toothless and I could resume our initial flight direction, I heard an unfamiliar female voice cry out angrily. "Hey, give me back my camisole, you perverted thief." I saw the white mare from earlier quickly approaching Toothless in my position. Firstly, I'm not a thief. I never intended to take any of your clothes. Is this flimsy see-through search yours? I raised an eyebrow as I watched in rapt fascination as her cheeks took on a flushed look. Why yeah. Now give it back. She yelled before I handed this camisole of hers back to her, which she quickly placed it inside one of her saddlebags. Why would you want to wear such a flimsy garment as that anyways? I asked her, genuinely curious. What purpose does it serve? I wear it because it feels nice and comfortable, she replied, her blush fading only slightly. And others? I asked, catching on that there was more that she had not yet told me. Others wear it for sex. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Others wear it for what now? Sex. Once more they wear it to have sex. Multiple ponies around us turned to look at us, hushed whispers from one to another, as the Pegasus mare's blush returned with a vengeance. Gotta go, see ya. She yelled as she raced off, no doubt to escape the judgmental stares and whispers of the ponies who had just witnessed what had just happened. I was pretty embarrassed too. Though I had to chuckle, as I imagined someone else going through what I had just gone through. That certainly was an awkward way to expand my knowledge of an entirely different culture. I yelped, suddenly grateful for the saddle buckles, as Toothless performed several barrel rolls without warning. Hey! What was that for? I cried, watching my buddy look back at me before issuing guttural laughter and making kissy faces. I could feel my cheeks warm up at the accusation. It's not like that. I watched as Toothless rolled his eyes and jostled his back, making me grip onto the saddle in a natural reflex, despite the belts that secured me to the saddle. Hey! Do you want this job or not? Because I'm sure the guild has others that wouldn't mind taking this job, if you aren't serious about it, Zephyr groused, looking at me irritatedly, once she had flown back to me and was within shouting distance. Sorry. This big love decided to fly me through some laundry, and then we had to avoid the pony who owned the laundry, and dodge and weave through the city's street level, before getting temporarily lost, and reuniting the laundry with its owner, I informed her. Toothless gave me an annoyed-sounding grunt, shaking his head in disagreement, before shrugging his shoulders, as though he didn't understand why I was trying to pin the blame on him. I wasn't really upset with him, but it did irk me that I nearly got clotheslined by a clothesline. And no, it wasn't my first time seeing a clothesline someone. Why? Rough and tough. If they can endure the most amount of pain while making it look epic and awesome, then they'll definitely try it. CTD 15 minutes later. CTD location. Global Endurance Race Guard Barracks. I dismounted Toothless and looked towards Zephyr. Toothless wouldn't fit within the barracks, and I noticed some of the other guards acting edgy with Toothless around. Spears lowered a little more, pointing towards Toothless as guards passed by him and swords removed from their scabbard as well. They are going to attack Toothless, are they? I asked Zephyr worriedly. He should be fine as long as he doesn't make any rapid movement, but we can assign made up to indicate that he isn't to be attacked, except in defense, Zephyr replied, sounding particularly unconcerned, and not even glancing in Toothless' direction. Yeah. We should do that. What kind of friend would I be if I didn't look after his well-being? I'll be here with him until that sign is finished. I started scratching beneath his chin, before getting licked by Toothless. I wiped my face, and flung my arms to fling off the dragon's saliva. I gave him the stink eye. Ugh. You know that doesn't wash out. He gave another guttural chortle, his mouth parted in a mirthful grin. I proceeded to remove the saddle and tack, and set them off to the side, before tackling Toothless, my arms wrapping around his chest, as I did my best to play wrestle with my friend. Zephyr went into the largest-looking yurt, and it wasn't all that long afterwards before I heard someone cry out, "Release that poor creature, foul dragon!" Toothless leapt back, just avoiding a spear, rolling at a tannish-brown stallion with a cropped mane that was an orangish tan color. His cutie mark was a light brown twister with horns on either side of the twister image, and a thin narrow ribbon about halfway down, which had the shape of a spade. I leapt between the stallion and Toothless, holding up my hands in a placating manner. Whoa. Hey, don't hurt Toothless. We're just playing with each other. The stallion raised an eyebrow at me. You're friends with a dragon? Yeah, I know that you guys don't have the best relationship with dragons, but surely not all dragons can be bad. Come on, that would be like saying all ponies jump to conclusions or all griffins are impatient, I said with a small snicker, to which he just looked at me blindly. Sorry, but aside from that, we don't exactly come from these parts, so we aren't the same. You see, is that why he doesn't speak for himself? Yeah, but that doesn't mean he's not intelligent, or that he's not capable of other forms of communication. Fine, don't believe me. By Thor's hammer, do you look for the worst in anything that isn't a pony? You can never be too careful around dragons. No dragon can be trusted. I, Dusty, shall vanquish this menace. The stallion threw the spear at my buddy, and I was already withdrawing my sword Inferno from its scabbard. Swinging downward, the spear's tip embedded into the ground, just at Toothless' feet. I watched as Toothless bounded over, leaping towards the stallion, toppling him to the ground in a swift tackle before placing a clawed foot on the stallion's neck. It looked for a brief moment that Toothless was going to do more to the stallion, but instead he just growled at him, all the while pinning him down. What in Tartarus is going on here? I watched as Zephyr stomped over to where Toothless and the stallion was. She glared at Toothless, pointing a hoof in my direction. I watched Toothless look at me, tilting his head in her direction. Yeah, you can get off of him. Toothless had grasped the spear, yanking it out from the ground, and turning it so the point pointed skyward once again. Alright, who's the damn little shit that started this? Besides the stallion, Dragon and his rider, who saw what happened. About 15 hoods went up. Alright, line up outside of the command tent, and come in one at a time. CTD 3 hours later. CTD okay, I've heard all the eyewitnesses' accounts. Zephyr turned to the stallion called Dusty. Dusty, why did you attack the dragon, even when his rider reassured you that the dragon wasn't dangerous? Because dragons can't be trusted. Dusty cried, glaring at Toothless, his eyes mere pinpricks, and his brows furrowed in anger, and with his ears laid back, as he ground his teeth together. Even when the dragon's trainer gives his word that the dragon won't hurt anybody. Zephyr retorted, her eyes narrowing, and raising an eyebrow as she glared at the hobbled stallion. They killed my family. They killed my friends. We must destroy any dragon that would dare to live within our lands. They must die for the deaths they have caused. You're going to blame a dragon that wasn't even there for the ones that did kill your family. Then where would the bloodshed end, huh? What if the dragons decided to attack because we'd killed one of them? It would only end with the complete annihilation of either us or them. And even if we did take that path, it wouldn't bring back the slain. It won't make the aid go away. You have served the GER guards well, but I'm afraid that I can't overlook this attempted dragon slaughter. Zephyr turned to a larger, beefier stallion whose coat was a light Trelan, while his mane was several shades darker. Turbulence. Watch Dusty, while I sent a runner to fetch a couple of guards to take Dusty to be processed, and await his trial. Yes, ma'am. The stallion called Turbulence replied, snapping off a quick salute, before going over to where Dusty was hobbled, and an attached chain was wrapped around what looked to be a pony version of Stockets. Swiftwind. Zephyr shouted. Here, ma'am. A light gold Pegasus mare with a light sap green mane stepped forward. Her wings were slightly larger, but her build was leaner, yet slightly muscled. A runner's build for endurance running and flying. Go into Portsville and inform the city guard that we have a pony to be processed and that a trial needs to set up for him, and that they should send a couple of guards to escort the prisoner to his new home. Yes, ma'am. Swiftwind also saluted, before rapidly flying in the direction of Portsville. Zephyr then came over. Your dragon wasn't hurt, was he? I'm very sorry about Dusty. I've never had any problems with him before today. I don't know. You mind if I look you over, Toothless? I smiled, watching him roll his eyes, and open and close his mouth as though he was being mouthy with me. I wasn't too afraid if he was in high enough spirits to give me lip, but he let me look him over nevertheless. I don't see anything. So I must have hit the spear down early enough that the tip of the spear didn't touch my good buddy. I grinned, throwing an arm around Toothless' neck. Toothless suddenly ducked his head out of my embrace, and licked the side of my face. Ugh. Toothless. I exclaimed, my right side of my face covered in his smelly dragon drool. Though I couldn't be too upset with the big lug, as the other guards laughed at Toothless' antics with me. The terse atmosphere that had been there earlier dissipated like clouds before the mighty sun. All right. Everyone back to duty. Hiccup, follow me, Zephyr said promptly once the group had finished chuckling. What about the sign? Doesn't it still need to be made up? I asked, not moving an inch from Toothless' side. He was already attacked once and I would not be gone if it were to happen again. It already has and will be delivered shortly. I wouldn't fret much though. Hiccup, your dragon friend will be looked after by the guards. And unless they want to end up on the wrong side of some rope, they will make sure he doesn't get harmed, Zephyr said. I couldn't tell if it was a death threat or an imprisonment threat, but either way it made me gulp a little just because of how she said it. I smiled uneasily in response to what she said before following her into the building that she had put herself in front of. It didn't look like anything that I had seen on Berg or even in the city, but instead it was more like a makeshift building in that it looked quickly put up and would hardly stand up to any harsh weather. The structure looked a little flimsy and the wood that made up the building was thinly cut and held together by some very small nails. This was hardly a safe structure to be in if there was a typhoon or even a large windstorm. When I had finished scrutinizing the structure of the building, I focused back on Zephyr, who was looking through a few sacks and chests that were lined up along the sides of the building. They were aligned in a way that left one major pathway down the middle of the building and a few side paths that branched out in order to access further back items. I looked past Zephyr to see 3 more guards farther back doing the same as she was doing, with the only exception being one of the 3 holding what looked like a flagged piece of wood and writing on it. They were all griffins, which was probably the first time I had seen an mixed group. Right, Hiccup, there are a few things that you need in order to work as a race guard, Zephyr said as she continued to dig through the bags and chests. She seemed to be after certain items, but as to what they were, I had no clue and so I had to wait for her to show them to me. It felt a little awkward waiting on her to pull out the items needed, but with me just standing there, shifting my weight from side to side. Not to mention making brief eye contact with one of the workers at the end who would look away immediately the moment we made eye contact. Grab one of the empty packs beside you, Zephyr said, not even shifting our attention from her previous task. Once you have one, come over here and we are going to fill it up with the needed tools. I looked around me a few times before my eyes finally caught sight of what looked like this pack that Zephyr had spoken about. It seemed that this pack was designed for ponies or griffins, since there was actually 2 large pouches connected by a thick strap that would most likely go over top of a 4-legged being. It would be impossible for me to utilize the pack without making some major modifications to the pack itself. though perhaps I could strap it across Toothless. Hey, human, pay attention. Zephyr snapped, causing me to whip my head back to where she was standing. Though instead of giving all of her attention to the sacks and chests, she was now sitting on her back legs while holding some items in her claws. Take these items and just put them in the sacks. What you do afterwards is none of my business. Though a bit of advice. Get your head out of the clouds, she said dryly. Heh, yes, ma'am, I replied, rubbing the back of my neck before quickly two-hand catching a smaller pouch that she threw at me. I briefly peeked inside to find that there were roughly 5 red tubes and 5 blue tubes that had a section of the end that looked thicker than the rest of them. It made me wonder what the thicker section was for, so I pulled one out of the satchel, inspecting it carefully. It seemed that Zephyr took notice before I could test out the item. That's a flare, used to signal others from far away. Blue is used to signal for help if something out of your league happens, while red is for medical purposes. All you have to do is twist the larger section before throwing it or holding it. Just don't hold the other end or you're going to get burned rather badly, and those claws of yours don't look all too strong, she said casually. Not a lot of instruction, mind you, but I guess it will do for the time being. At least I had experience handling items that burned. Right, then side up, I said before putting the flares back into the pouch. Good, next item, she said as she tossed the next thing she was holding in her claws towards me. This time I was ready for her to toss it and caught it easily enough before examining it with a small bit of amusement. I guess the brief bit of examination I did happen to catch Zephyr's eye. It's R, she started before I chuckled. I know what a coil of rope is, Zephyr, I said shortly after I finished my chuckling. Good. Then we can move on, though there isn't much more, she said as she moved towards me with another stick and claw. This one looked nothing like the flares that were given earlier. Instead it was much longer, closer to the length of a blade, but all it had, that was metal, was 2 little prongs at the end. It looked like a weapon at first, but how could it even hurt someone? Besides, I had my only blade. I won't exactly need a blade, you see, I said before this time she cut me off. It's not a blade, human. Let me show you, she said before turning around. Hey, Blackie, get over here. A certain griffin came over, one that was completely the opposite of the name she had just called. Yeah, she called for Blackie and instead got a griffin that appeared to be as white as snow. Whether this was some sort of ironic name, or a nickname, I couldn't tell. The griffin didn't say a word, but the moment he got close, Zephyr whipped out the artificial stick and prodded at him. Now at first nothing happened, the griffin just looking down at the point of contact. His eyes stayed down there for a good moment before they slowly looked upwards at Zephyr, pupils decreasing in size until they were little pinpricks, much like Toothless's were when under control. Before he could say a word, his body started convulsing as though he had gotten struck by lightning. I mean, I have seen a few people get light zaps before, but this was far beyond that. It took a few seconds before Zephyr pulled the stick from his body and the griffin collapsed to the ground, much to the amusement of the other who were taking inventory in the back. At first I was a little concerned with what had happened, but then I noticed Zephyr looking unconcerned. Is he going to be alright? I asked Zephyr, looking over my shoulder where the twitching griffin lay. Oh, he'll be alright after a while. He just needs to recover from having so many volts delivered to his body. And what I just demonstrated is perhaps one of our most important tools to incapacitating any of the more belligerent of the flyers we may encounter. Though, it really isn't suggested to be used against a group of flyers, unless you're close to the ground. Others in the antagonistic group would take advantage of your momentary distraction to either hurt you, or maybe even kill you, if they're angry enough, Zephyr explained with a giant grin stretched across her beak. Anyway, this is a stun stick. Powered by magic and able to absorb ambient magic from nearly anywhere, it produces a knife shock that can incapacitate even the hardiest of griffins or pegasi, who, might I add, are pretty resistant to lighting. I merely gave a low whistle before she handed me the stick. I looked it over a little, noticing a small button on one side of the stick. I didn't even need her to explain to me how to use it, my mind already figuring it out. The button caused some sort of mechanism to allow the magic to travel up the metal prongs and arch in between them, allowing for someone to stun nearly anything. Of course, the only way I found out about the arching lighting was by pressing the button a few times in experimentation. Well, that's about it, hiccup. All that's left is to give you some rations and a few first aid supplies. I'll have Blackie gather them while we discuss your coverage areas, Zephyr said as she began walking out the door, Blackie already grumbling and moving about. The pack will be on Toothless outside, I said, rubbing the back of my neck with one hand as I backed up to the door, almost expecting him to attack me out of spite for being shocked. Instead he just continued to mumble all the while scrounging for my other equipment. As I exited, I noticed one thing that was surprisingly odd. Scratch that, extremely odd. Toothless was rolling on his back, swatting up at a toy on the end of a string which was tied to a stick. There was a female Pegasus hovering above Toothless, constantly moving the toy which looked much like a firefly. Toothless was constantly rolling this way and that, reaching up with his claws in an attempt to swap the firefly toy out of midair. With the way his tongue was hanging out and the big goofy grin on his face, it seemed like he was having the time of his life. My jaw hung open for a few moments before I forcibly clamped it shut and turned to find Zephyr, who was entering another one of their makeshift buildings just to my left. I couldn't help but grumble at the sheer ridiculousness that Toothless was creating. Well, at least he was proving that he was obviously harmless. Figuring that I might as well follow Zephyr in the meantime, I left Toothless to continue endearing himself to the female Pegasus. As I entered the building that Zephyr had entered not long before, I saw scrolls of all kinds, some that looked to be even taller than I was, while others went as short as the width of my body, well, underneath my arms anyways. I watched as Zephyr went to one of the scroll holdings and removed one that looked relatively less etched, as some of the scrolls were so yellowed and riddled with cracks and tears that it looked like they might crumble into dust if someone were to touch it. Zephyr rolled the scroll and pointed towards the massive clouds that I had seen earlier, where the Cloud City is. This is where your patrol route begins. The racetrack runs directly below the Vecbrea, which is what this huge cloud mass is called. It actually has several cities on it, but you shouldn't need to worry about it, as the track runs beneath the cloud, and not over it. The racetrack runs through the middle of the strait here, pointing to a huge strait that was just several miles smaller than the cloud of Vecbrea, and your route will end when you see this small island to the north. The strait looked similar to a clock, but with a strong upward curl of the toe region. It was near the bottom of the indentation near where the toe started to curl upwards that a small island was seen on the map. Sounds like a simple enough route. How long do I work and how do I get paid? I inquired of Zephyr. You'll work from about an hour just after sunup until just after sunset. We tend to like using Testrals and Griffins that have excellent night vision for the night patrols. But you won't have to worry about that. Anyways, you go to the Freelancer Guild to pick up your pay. Do you have any other questions? Zephyr asked. I can't think of any at this time, so I'll go get Toothless geared up and we'll be off to start our section of the patrols, I replied. Remember, be safe out there, Zephyr called out, though she was gazing out of an open flap in the tent's fabric. I smiled, both touched by her concern and because of who she was saying this to. I will, I responded before closing the door behind me. I gathered both my personal gear and the gear Zephyr had given, which Blackie had apparently dropped off by the tent. As I strode over, slightly struggling with the weight of both packs, my torso bent slightly forward, as I compensated for the weight of the packs on my back. The Pegasus mare was still playing with Toothless, letting him bat at the firefly suspended on a small rope which was attached to a stick that was about the length of her own torso. Excuse me, miss. I need to get Toothless saddled up so that we can start our work, I explained to her. The mare vocalized her disappointment. She flew off in the direction of one of the barrack houses, waving a foreleg at Toothless as she departed. All right, Toothless. We have some work to do, I declared, as I started placing the saddle blanket over his back, before placing a saddle over top of it. I checked the belts for wear and tear as I cinched each one tightly and securely. I'm going to have to talk to somebody about getting some oil, so that I can keep the leather in good condition. Then I hooked my rucksack behind my saddle and giving it an experimental tug to ensure that it was secure. I placed the saddlebags just behind my saddle, though I had to leg the securing straps nearly all the way out, as Toothless had more girth than a pony. I also gave the saddlebags an experimental tug, and satisfied that they were secure, swung my leg over, as I mounted Toothless. Remember where the big cloud was, bud? He just looked at me with an amused stare. Yeah, you're right. Anyways, that's where we'll start our patrol, is underneath the huge cloud with Toothless powerfully beating his wings. We began our flight towards Vecbrea. If you guys are enjoying this story, please give it a like, comment your thoughts, give me a follow,